Hello, beautiful friends. I am Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, welcoming you to this episode of Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you rest, relax, and fall asleep, and also is here to help you deepen in your connection with your angels who love you so. If we're meeting for the first time, I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, and an encourager of souls. And I do this through one-on-one angel sessions, soul mentoring, and a variety of classes and services. And you can find out more about the work that I do when you awaken at illuminatingsouls.com or on my Facebook page of the same name. And I also have a daily inspiration email blast where I will send you an inspiring message every weekday. And you can sign up for that at my website, illuminatingsouls.com. But for now, the angels and I are here to help you fall asleep. So I invite you to get cozy and snuggle on in, letting your body know that it has permission to begin relaxing, and also allowing your mind to begin to wind down. Our minds are remarkable instruments. And I know for me, sometimes, even though my body is tired, I crawl into bed and my mind continues going at full speed. And that's when I find sleep podcasts to be so helpful. I've been using them for years, and now I'm in the practice every evening when I get in bed, I put in my earbuds and I pick a sleep podcast. There's a variety of them that I listen to, including Sleep With Me, Get Sleepy, Sleepy Time Tales, and one that's just called Sleepy. And I appreciate them so much because it provides the opportunity for my mind to shift focus and get away from the gymnastics it's doing in terms of whatever I had been processing during the waking time of my life. And that's why I have created this podcast for you. That this will create a gateway for you where you can experience the love of your angels, allowing the light to wash over you. And the angelic energy is very compatible with rest. So you don't have to do anything. The angels will do the heavy lifting here. I'll be bringing forth the angels for you. And then I'm going to read to you a story, and we'll be here for about an hour, so you've plenty of time to drift off. And if for some reason it takes you longer, you can queue up another episode. There are plenty of them here for you, all infused with the angelic energy. I also want to thank you for listening. You have a lot of options for how you use your time, and I'm grateful to have this time with you. And if you are enjoying the podcast, if you would consider leaving a rating or review or share about it with some friends, I would be ever so grateful. We have a beautiful community that is listening to the podcast that ripples around the world. So you, dear one, are a part of our beautiful circle of light. I always believe in my heart that whenever two or more are gathered in God's name or in the name of the divine, that miracles happen. So here we are gathered together. And the energy is being calibrated for you. Don't feel as if you need to tune into all the other energies around you. The beautiful thing about this podcast and this work is the angels will calibrate this energy specifically for you. The angels know you. They understand what is transpiring in your life. And they are here to support you. So just take a breath in and allow the love of your angels to be with you now. And each episode, I look for a theme. What can I bring forward to be of service to you today? And I was guided to share with you one of my absolute favorite quotes. It's a quote that held my hand through much of my awakening when I felt like I was going into blind curve after blind curve. And I did not know where I would wind up or who I would even be on the other side of whatever this was. So this is a quote by the poet Rilke. He writes, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves. Like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." And just take that in for a moment. When this quote first found me, the invitation to live the question was the thing that gave me hope. I'm a pretty intellectual person, and for any of you who know astrology, I have Mercury in Gemini, and that means I love figuring things out. I love to blueprint things. I love to know where I'm going and how I'm going to get there. Maybe you can relate. So as I was going through my awakening, everything was a question. Everything. In some ways, I was dismantling what I thought to be the foundation of my life. I was dismantling who I thought I was, how I saw myself, my beliefs. Everything was up for contemplation. So this idea that I could live the question and not know the answer yet brought me profound comfort. And over the years, I have learned how important this is when it says to live the questions because you're not yet ready for the answers. That is so true. When I was in the depth of my internal struggles prior to my awakening, if someone would have given me the answer, which would basically be, you're going to learn to talk to angels and you're going to leave your job and you're going to teach people about angels and you're going to leave Los Angeles and you're going to move to Northern California with your husband, elements of that would have sounded lovely, but they also would have sounded deeply foreign to me. They would have scared me, wouldn't have made sense, and I would have likely pulled my energy back because that's what I do when I'm uncomfortable. So if you've heard me talk about this in other podcasts, I often share that the angels get you and God gets you. God and the angels know you. They know how you function. They get you. And so God and the angels knew that they couldn't reveal too much to me too quickly. My husband likes to say that the strategy for getting me to do something is to wait in the tall grass and pique my curiosity, and eventually I'll move. So I bring to you this quote in case you feel like you're navigating a blind curve. Our curiosity can be a beautiful driver in life, but it also means that we acknowledge that we do not yet have our answer. There's a wonderful therapist that I check in with periodically, and I recently had a conversation with him about something I was struggling with. So yes, I am still an earth girl, and I have things that I struggle with too. I'm a human being. And I was deeply frustrated with my process because I hadn't been able to figure it out. That's a very Mercury and Gemini thing. We want to figure it out. It frustrates me when I cannot find my answer. And without really knowing my relationship with this quote, he said something akin to, I invite you to approach this with a sense of curiosity. And as soon as he said that, it's like all the tumblers aligned. And I was like, oh, that. You know, one of the things about spiritual principles is they continue to be our teachers. It's not like we learn it in a weekend workshop and we're done. We're like, I'm good. I got that. They continue to revisit us, and they continue to shift and change form as we do. And I find that especially with all that's happening in the world and the phase of life that I'm in, I am living the question, which is not my most comfortable position, but it is what it is. So I share this quote with you today, and I'll tag on one other pearl that I'm going to pair with it. I don't know how many of you are MTV babies, and that you might watch The Real World, and The Challenge. I love all those shows. I sort of started watching them with the first Real World back in the 90s. And there is one of the cast members who's been in a lot of their shows, CT, whose name is Chris. And I won't go into his whole story. It's been very interesting to watch him grow up in front of the cameras. But they did a wedding special. He was getting married, and a few years ago, one of the great loves of his life had passed away, and so his cousin was asking him, are you ready for this? Meaning, are you ready to get married? And CT said this, just when I thought I had the answer, life changed the question. Is that not absolutely brilliant? Just when I thought I had the answer, life changed the question. And wow, isn't life changing the question a lot right now? So, my darling ones, if you are in the midst of the questions, if you do not yet know your answers, know that this is a sacred passage and you are not alone in all that you are navigating. The angels are with you and God is with you. And the wisdom of your soul is helping you to find your way through whatever this is. So I invite you to take a deep breath in. And even though the angels are already here, I hope you can feel them. I'm just realizing I have not done our invocation yet, so I'm going to do that for you. I'm going to join you in taking a nice deep breath in and releasing. And beautiful angels on high, I know you are already here, but it warms my heart to ask you to be here with us now. Angels, I ask that you infuse this broadcast with waves of love and healing and light and compassion for all who hear this message. Angels, I ask that you assist each one of us in navigating the questions we are living, helping each one of us to connect with the streams of wisdom, of inspiration, of resourcefulness and resiliency. Help each one of us to step into even more of our authentic inspiration and light. And angels, we ask that you clear our energy fields through the heart of God, helping to clear anything that does not belong to us, and also helping to realign our consciousness so that we can come into deeper relationship with well-being. So, dear ones, just take a deep breath in and allow the love of the angels to pour over you. And visualize, if you will, imagine it to be so that the angels are infusing the room you are in with a soft, gentle, healing light. This light is deeply compatible with rest and sleep. And so as it comes to you, it helps to signal to your mind and body that it has permission to drift off, that you are coming into the sanctuary of rest, and that the angels will watch over you, that God is with you. And we are so deeply grateful for the gift of you. And angels, we ask that you place love around all the questions each one of us is living right now. helping to bring healing to the places of uncertainty and discomfort, helping us to remember that we are bright, big souls, and that we are being cared for and held in the heart of God. So, dear ones, just breathe in and just let this light flow to every cell in your body, every thought in your mind, and every emotion in your heart. You are a beloved of God. You matter. Your life matters. You are a bringer of light. And you are worthy of love and goodness. And in this moment, I say a prayer in your name. I hold you in my heart, and I thank God for the gift of you. And I affirm that right now, where we are, God is. Love is. And there's nothing you need to do. Just be. And breathe. And know that you are a beloved of this universe. And so, beautiful ones, while you rest, I'm going to read to you a story. So we're going to return to the book A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I'll share with you a synopsis of the story in case you haven't heard the other episodes. And then we'll dive in. We're getting to the really cool and magical part. So Sara Crewe is a little girl who spent her early years in India with her father, Captain Crewe, who is a handsome, dashing, wealthy man who deeply loves his daughter. But as was done in the time, children were sent back to London for boarding school. So Sara has been sent to Miss Minchin's seminary for young women. And Miss Minchin is not a nice woman. She is manipulative and harsh, and she deeply resents Sara because Captain Crewe spoils her so. But even though Sara has material wealth and privilege, she is not a spoiled child. In fact, she is generous and kind and empathic and cares deeply about the well-being of those around her. And then something very sad happens. Captain Crewe invests in a gold mine with a friend and loses all of his money and gets very sick and passes away. And when Miss Minchin finds out that Sara has no wealth left, she makes her a servant of the seminary, and Sara is sent to live in the attic with Becky, the scullery maid. And that's the deeply sad part of the story. And there is a house next door to the seminary that has been vacant, but there has been activity there recently, and a gentleman from India who is very sick has moved into it. And it's not Sara's father. Just don't get your hopes up. That's not where we're going. And he has a servant called Alaskar, and his name is Ramdas. And in the previous chapter, Sara met Ramdas when Ramdas's monkey got away and came in through Sara's attic window. So now a very serendipitous meeting has taken place, where Ramdas is now aware of Sara. And in the last chapter, Sara got into trouble with Miss Minchin, and so this is where we're picking up. This is chapter 12, The Other Side of the Wall. When one lives in a row of houses, it is interesting to think of the things which are being done and said on the other side of the wall of the very rooms one is living in. Sara was fond of amusing herself by trying to imagine the things hidden by the wall which divided the select seminary from the Indian gentleman's house. She knew that the schoolroom was next to the Indian gentleman's study, and she hoped that the wall was thick so that the noise made sometimes after lesson hours would not disturb him. "I am growing quite fond of him," she said to Ermengarde, and Ermengarde is one of her friends who's a student at the seminary. "I should not like him to be disturbed. I have adopted him for a friend. You can do that with people you never speak to at all. You can just watch them and think about them and be sorry for them until they seem almost like relations. I'm quite anxious sometimes when I see the doctor call twice a day." "I have very few relations," said Ermengarde reflectively, "and I am very glad of it. I don't like those I have. My two aunts are always saying, 'Dear me, Ermengarde, you are very fat. You shouldn't eat sweets.' And my uncle is always asking me things like, 'When did Edward III ascend the throne? And who died of a surfeit of lampreys?'" Sara laughed. "People you never speak to can't ask you questions like that," she said. "And I'm sure the Indian gentleman wouldn't, even if he was quite intimate with you. I am fond of him." She had become fond of the large family because they looked happy. And I should mention the large family is a family she has watched from afar, and she calls them the large family because they have so many children, and they look so very happy. And as it turns out, the father of the large family works for the Indian gentleman, so the threads are starting to weave together. So she had become fond of the large family because they looked happy, but she had become fond of the Indian gentleman because he looked unhappy. He had evidently not fully recovered from some very severe illness. In the kitchen, where of course the servants looked through some mysterious means, knew everything, there was much discussion of his case. He was not an Indian gentleman really, but an Englishman who had lived in India. He had met with great misfortunes which had for a time so imperiled his whole fortune that he had thought himself ruined and disgraced forever. The shock had been so great that he had almost died of brain fever, and ever since he had been shattered in health, though his fortunes had changed and all his possessions had been restored to him. His trouble and peril had been connected with mines. "And mines with diamonds in them," said the cook. No saving of mine ever goes into no mines, particularly diamond mines, with a side glance at Sara. We all know something of them. Well, he felt as my papa felt, Sara thought. He was ill as my papa was, but he did not die. So her heart was more drawn to him than ever before. When she was sent out at night, she used to sometimes feel quite glad, because there was always a chance that the curtains of the house next door might not yet be closed, and she could look into the warm room and see her adopted friend. When no one was about, she used sometimes to stop and, holding to the iron railings, wish him a good night as if he could hear her. Perhaps you can feel if you can't hear, was her fancy. Perhaps kind thoughts reach people somehow, even through windows and doors and walls. Perhaps you feel a little warm and comforted, and don't know why. When I am standing here in the cold and hoping you will get well and happy again, I am so very sorry for you, she would whisper in an intense little voice. I wish you had a little missus who could pet you as I used to pet Papa when he had a headache. I should like to be your little missus myself, poor dear. Good night. Good night. God bless you. She would go away feeling quite comforted and a little warmer herself. Her sympathy was so strong that it seemed as if it must reach him, that it must reach him somehow, as he sat alone in his armchair by the fire, nearly always in a great dressing gown, and nearly always with his forehead resting in his hand as he gazed hopelessly into the fire. He looked to Sara like a man who had a trouble on his mind, still not merely like one whose troubles lay all in the past. He always seems as if he were thinking of something that hurts him now, she said to herself. But he has got his money back, and he will get over his brain fever in time, so he ought not to look like that. I wonder if there is something else. If there was something else, something even servants did not hear of, she could not help believing that the father of the large family knew it, the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency. And just to interject, Sara made up names for everyone in the large family, so this is not his real name. Mr. Montmorency went to see him often, and Mrs. Montmorency and all the little Montmorencys went too, though less often. He seemed particularly fond of the two elder little girls, the Janet and Nora who had been so alarmed when their small brother Donald had given Sara his 6pence. He had, in fact, a very tender place in his heart for all children, and particularly for the little girls. Janet and Nora were as fond of him as he was of them, and he looked forward with his greatest pleasure to the afternoons when they were allowed to cross the square and make their well-behaved little visits to him. They were extremely decorous little visits because he was an invalid. He is a poor thing, said Janet, and he says we cheer him up. We try to cheer him up quietly. Janet was the head of the family and kept the rest of it in order. It was she who decided when it was discreet to ask the Indian gentleman to tell stories about India. And it was she who saw when he was tired and it was time to steal away and tell Ram Dass to go to him. They were very fond of Ram Dass. He could have told any number of stories if he had been able to speak anything but Hindustani. The Indian gentleman's real name was Mr. Carrisford, and Janet told Mr. Carrisford about the encounter with the little girl who was not a beggar. And she means Sara, if you missed the rest of the story. They had an encounter with Sara. He was very much interested, and all the more so when he heard from Ram Dass of the adventure of the monkey on the roof. Ram Dass made for him a very clear picture of the attic and its desolateness, of the bare floor and the broken plaster, the rusty, empty grate, and the hard, narrow bed. Carmichael, he said to the father of the large family after he had heard this description, I wonder how many of the attics in the square are like that one, and how many wretched little servant girls sleep on such beds while I toss on my down pillows, loaded and harassed by wealth that is most of it not mine. My dear fellow, Mr. Carmichael answered cheerily, the sooner you cease tormenting yourself, the better it will be for you. If you possessed all of the wealth and all of the Indies, you could not set right all of the discomforts in the world. And if you begin to refurnish all the attics in the square, there would still remain all the attics in all the other squares and all the other streets to put in order. And there you are. Mr. Carrisford sat and bit his nails as he looked into the glowing bed of coals in the grate. Do you suppose, he said slowly after a pause, do you think it is possible that the other child, the child I never cease thinking of, I believe could possibly be reduced to any such condition as the poor little soul next door? Mr. Carmichael looked at him uneasily. He knew that the worst thing the man could do for himself, for this reason and his health, was to begin to think in the particular way of this particular subject. If the child at Madame Pascal's school in Paris was the one you are in search of, he answered soothingly, she would seem to be in the hands of people who can afford to take care of her. They adopted her because she had been the favorite companion of their little daughter who died. They had no other children, and Madame Pascal said that they were extremely well-to-do Russians. And the wretched woman actually did not know where they had taken her, exclaimed Mr. Carrisford. Mr. Carmichael shrugged his shoulders. She was a shrewd, worldly Frenchwoman and was evidently only too glad to get the child so comfortably off her hands when the father's death left her totally unprovided for. Women of her type do not trouble themselves about the futures of children who might prove burdens. The adopted parents apparently disappeared and left no trace. But you say if the child was the one I am in search of. You say if. We are not sure. There was a difference in the name. Madame Pascal pronounced it as if it were Carew instead of Crew. But that might merely be a matter of pronunciation. The circumstances were curiously similar. An English officer in India had placed his motherless little girl at the school. He had died suddenly after losing his fortune. Mr. Carmichael paused a moment as if a new thought had occurred to him. Are you sure the child was left at a school in Paris? Are you sure it was Paris? My dear fellow, broke forth Carrisford with restless bitterness, I am sure of nothing. I never saw either the child or her mother. Ralph Crewe and I loved each other as boys, but we had not met since our school days until we met in India. I was absorbed in the magnificent promise of the mines. He became absorbed too. The whole thing was so huge and glittering that we half lost our heads. When we met, we scarcely spoke of anything else. I only knew that the child had been sent to school somewhere. I do not even remember now how I knew it. He was beginning to be excited. He always became excited when his still weakened brain was stirred by memories of the catastrophes of the past. Mr. Carmichael watched him anxiously. It was necessary to ask some questions, but they must be put quietly and with caution. But you had reason to think the school was in Paris. Yes, was the answer. Because her mother was a Frenchwoman, and I had heard that she wished her child to be educated in Paris. It seemed only likely that she would be there. Yes, Mr. Carmichael said, it seems more than probable. The Indian gentleman leaned forward and struck the table with a long, wasted hand. Carmichael, he said, I must find her. If she is alive, she is somewhere. If she is friendless and penniless, it is through my fault. How is a man to get back his nerve with a thing like that on his mind? This sudden change of luck at the mines has made realities of all our most fantastic dreams, and poor Crewe's child may be begging in the street. No, no, said Carmichael, try to be calm. Console yourself with the fact that when she is found, you have a fortune to hand over to her. Why was I not man enough to stand my ground when things looked black? Carrisford groaned in petulant misery. I believe I should have stood my ground if I had not been responsible for other people's money as well as my own. Poor Crewe had put into the scheme every penny that he owned. He trusted me. He loved me. And he died thinking I had ruined him. I, Tom Carrisford, who played cricket at Eton with him. What a villain he must have thought of me. Don't reproach yourself so bitterly. I don't reproach myself because the speculation threatened to fail. I reproach myself for losing my courage. I ran away like a swindler and a thief because I could not face my friend and tell him that I had ruined him and his child. The good-hearted father of the large family put his hand on his shoulder. You ran away because your brain had given away under the strain of mental torture, he said. You were half delirious already. If you had not been, you would have stayed and fought it out. You were in a hospital, strapped down in a bed, raving with brain fever. 2 days after you left the place, remember that? Carrisford dropped his forehead in his hands. Good God, yes, he said. I was driven mad with dread and horror. I had not slept for weeks. That is explanation enough in itself, said Mr. Carmichael. How could the man on the verge of a brain fever judge sanely? Carrisford shook his drooping head. And when I returned to consciousness, poor Crewe was dead and buried, and I seemed to remember nothing. I did not remember the child for months and months. Even when I began to recall her existence, everything seemed in a sort of haze. He stopped a moment and rubbed his forehead. It sometimes seems so now when I try to remember. Surely I must sometime have heard Crewe speak of the school she was sent to, don't you think so? He might not have spoken of it definitely. You never seem to have even heard her real name. He used to call her by an odd pet name he had invented. He called her his little Mrs. But the wretched minds drove everything else out of our heads. We talked of nothing else. If he spoke of the school, I forgot, and now I shall never remember. Come, come, said Carmichael. We shall find her yet. We will continue to search for Madame Pascal's good-natured Russians. She seems to have a vague idea that they lived in Moscow. We will take that as a clue, and I will go to Moscow. If I were able to travel, I would go with you, said Carrisford. But I can only sit here wrapped in furs and stare at the fire. And when I look into it, I seem to see Crewe's gay young face gazing back at me. He looks as if he were asking me a question. Sometimes I dream of him at night, and he always stands before me and asks the same question in words. Can you guess what he says, Carmichael? Mr. Carmichael answered him in a rather low voice. Not exactly, he said. He always says, Tom, old man, Tom, where is the little missus? He caught at Carmichael's hand and clung to it. I must be able to answer him, I must, he said. Help me to find her, help me. On the other side of the wall, Sara was sitting in her garret, talking to Melchizedek. Melchizedek is her pet rat, who had come out for his evening meal. It has been hard to be a princess today, Melchizedek, she said. It has been harder than usual. It gets harder as the weather grows colder and the streets get more sloppy. When Lavinia laughed at my muddy skirt as I passed her in the hall, I thought of something to say in a flash. And I only just stopped myself in time. You can't sneer back at people like that if you are a princess. But you have to bite your tongue to hold yourself in. I bit mine. It was a cold afternoon, Melchizedek, and it's a cold night. Quite suddenly she put her black head down in her arms as she often did when she was alone. Oh, Papa, she whispered. What a long time it seems since I was your little missus. This was what happened that day on both sides of the wall. Chapter 13. One of the Populace. The winter was a wretched one. There were days on which Sara tramped through the snow when she went on her errands. There were worse days when the snow melted and combined itself with mud to form slush. There were others when the fog was so thick that the lamps on the street were lighted all day, and London looked as if it had looked the afternoon several years ago, when the cab had driven through the thoroughfares with Sara tucked up on its seat, leaning against her father's shoulder. On such days the windows of the house of the large family always looked delightfully cozy and alluring, and the study in which the Indian gentleman sat glowed with warmth and rich color. But the attic was dismal beyond words. There were no longer sunsets or sunrises to look at, and scarcely ever any stars. It seemed to Sara the clouds hung low over the skylight and were either gray or mud-colored, or dropping heavy rain. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, even when there was no special fog, the daylight was at an end. If it was necessary to go to her attic for anything, Sara was obliged to light a candle. The women in the kitchen were depressed, and that made them more ill-tempered than ever. Becky, the scullery maid, was driven like a little slave. If it wasn't for you, miss, she said hoarsely to Sara one night when she had crept into the attic, if it wasn't for you and the Bastille and being the prisoner in the next cell, I should die. That does seem real now, doesn't it? The missus is more like the head jailer every day she lives, and I can just see the big keys she carries. The cook, she's like one of the under jailers. Tell me some more, please, miss. Tell me about the subterranean passage we've dug under the walls. I'll tell you something warmer, shivered Sara. Get your coverlet and wrap it around you, and I'll get mine. And we will huddle close together on the bed, and I'll tell you about the tropical forest where the Indian gentleman's monkey used to live. When I see him sitting on the table near the window and looking out into the street with that mournful expression, I always feel sure he is thinking about the tropical forest where he used to swing by his tail from the coconut trees. I wonder who caught him, and if he left a family behind who depended on him for coconuts. That is warmer, miss, said Becky gratefully. But some ways even the Bastille is sort of heating when you get to telling me about it. That is because it makes you think of something else, said Sara, wrapping the coverlet around her until only her small dark face was to be seen looking out of it. I've noticed this. What you have to do with your mind when your body is miserable is to make it think of something else. Can you do it, miss? Faltered Becky, regarding her with admiring eyes. Sara knitted her brows a moment. Sometimes I can and sometimes I can't, she said stoutly. But when I can, I'm all right. And what I believe is that we always could if we practiced enough. I've been practicing a good deal lately, and it's beginning to be easier than it used to be. When things are horrible, just horrible, I think as hard as ever, I can be a princess, I say to myself. If I am a princess, and I'm a fairy one, and because I am a fairy, nothing can hurt me or make me uncomfortable. You don't know how it makes you forget, she says with a laugh. She had many opportunities of making her mind think of something else, and many opportunities of proving to herself whether or not she was a princess. But one of the strongest tests she was ever put to came on a certain dreadful day, which she often thought afterward would never quite fade out of her memory even in the years to come. For several days, it had rained continuously. The streets were chilly and sloppy and full of dreary, cold mist. There was mud everywhere, sticky London mud, and over everything the pall of drizzle and fog. Of course, there were several long and tiresome errands to be done. There always were on days like this, and Sara was sent out again and again until her shabby clothes were damp through. The absurd old feathers on her forlorn hat were more draggled and absurd than ever, and her downtrodden shoes were so wet they could not hold any more water. Added to this, she had been deprived of her dinner because Miss Minchin had chosen to punish her. She was so cold and hungry and tired that her face began to have a pinched look, and now and then some kind-hearted person passing her in the street glanced at her with sudden sympathy. But she did not know that. She hurried on, trying to make her mind think of something else. It was really very necessary. Her way of doing it was to pretend and suppose with all the strength that was left in her. But really, this time it was harder than she had ever found it, and once or twice she thought it almost made her more cold and hungry instead of less so. But she persevered obstinately, and as the muddy water squelched through her broken shoes and the wind seemed to try to drag her thin jacket from her, she talked to herself as she walked, though she did not speak aloud or even move her lips. Suppose I had on dry clothes, she thought. Suppose I had good shoes and a long, thick coat and merino stockings and a whole umbrella. And suppose just when I was near a baker's where they sold hot buns, I should find a sixpence which belonged to nobody. Suppose if I did, I should go into the shop and buy 6 of the hottest buns and eat them all without stopping. Some very odd things happen in this world sometimes. It certainly was an odd thing that happened to Sara. She had to cross the street just when she was saying this to herself. The mud was dreadful. She almost had to wade. She picked her way as carefully as she could, but she could not save herself much. Only, in picking her way, she had to look down at her feet in the mud. And in looking down, just as she reached the pavement, She saw something shining in the gutter. It was actually a piece of silver, a tiny piece trodden upon by many feet, but still with spirit enough left to shine a little. Not quite a sixpence, but the next best thing to it, a fourpenny piece. In 1 second it was in her cold little red and blue hand. "Oh," she gasped, "it's true, it's true." And then, if you will believe me, she looked straight at the shop directly facing her, and it was a baker's shop. And a cheerful, stout, motherly woman with rosy cheeks was putting into a window a tray of delicious, newly baked hot buns, fresh from the oven, large, plump, shiny buns with currants in them. It almost made Sara feel faint for a few seconds, the shock and the sight of the buns, and the delightful odors of warm bread floating up through the baker's cellar window. She knew she need not hesitate to use the little piece of money. It had evidently been lying in the mud for some time, and its owner was completely lost in the stream of passing people who crowded and jostled each other all day long. "But I'll go and ask the baker woman if she has lost anything," she said to herself rather faintly. So she crossed the pavement and put her wet foot on the step, and as she did so she saw something that made her stop. It was a little figure, more forlorn even than herself. A little figure which was not much more than a bundle of rags from which small, bare, red, muddy feet peeped out, only because the rags which their owner was trying to cover them were not long enough. Above the rags appeared a shocked head of tangled hair, and a dirty face with big, hollow, hungry eyes. Sara knew they were hungry eyes the moment she saw them, and she felt a sudden sympathy. "This," she said to herself with a little sigh, "is one of the populace, and she is hungrier than I am." The child, this one of the populace, stared up at Sara, and shuffled herself aside a little so as to give her room to pass. She was used to being made to give room to everybody. She knew that if a policeman chanced to see her, he would tell her to move on. Sara clutched her fourpenny piece and hesitated for a few seconds. Then she spoke to her. "Are you hungry?" she asked. The child shuffled herself and her rags a little more. "Ain't I just?" she said in a hoarse voice. "Just ain't I?" "Haven't you had any dinner?" said Sara. "No dinner," more hoarsely still and with more shuffling. "No breakfast, nor supper, no nothing." "Since when?" asked Sara. "Dunno. Never got nothing today, nowhere. I've asked and asked." Just to look at her made Sara more hungry and faint. But those queer little thoughts were at work in her brain, and she was talking to herself, though she was sick at heart. "If I'm a princess," she was saying, "if I'm a princess when they were poor and driven from their thrones, they always shared with the populace. If they met one poorer and hungrier than themselves, they always shared. Buns are a penny apiece. If it had been 6 pence, I could have eaten 6. It won't be enough for either of us, but it'll be better than nothing." "Wait a minute," she said to the beggar child. She went into the shop. It was warm and smelled deliciously. The woman was going to put some more hot buns into the window. "If you please," said Sara, "have you lost a 4 pence, a silver 4 pence?" And she held the forlorn little piece of money out to her. The woman looked at it, and then at her intense little face and draggled, once fine clothes. "Bless us, no," she answered. "Did you find it?" "Yes," said Sara, "in the gutter." "Keep it then," said the woman. "It may have been there for a week, and goodness knows who lost it. You could never find out." "I know that," said Sara, "but I thought I would ask you." Not many would, said the woman, looking puzzled and interested in the good-natured all at once. Do you want to buy something? She added as she saw Sara glance at the buns. 4 buns, if you please, said Sara, those at a penny each. The woman went to the window and put some in a paper bag. Sara noticed that she put in 6. I said 4, if you please, she explained. I only have 4 pence. I'll throw in 2 for make weight, said the woman with her good-natured look. I dare say you can eat them sometime. Aren't you hungry? A mist rose before Sara's eyes. Yes, she answered, I am very hungry, and I am much obliged to you for your kindness. And, she was going to add, there's a child outside who is hungrier than I am. But just at that moment, 2 or 3 customers came in at once, and each one seemed in a hurry, so she could only thank the woman again and go out. The beggar girl was still huddled up in the corner of the step. Sara opened the paper bag and took out one of the hot buns, which had already warmed her own cold hands a little. See, she said, putting the bun in the ragged lap. This is nice and hot. Eat it, and you will not feel so hungry. The child started and stared up at her as if such amazing good luck and almost frightened her. Then she snatched up the bun and began to cram it in her mouth with great wolfish bites. Oh my, Sara heard her say hoarsely in wild delight. Oh my. Sara took out 3 more buns and put them down. She is hungrier than I am, she said to herself. She's starving. But her hand trembled when she put down the 4th bun. I'm not starving, she said, and she put down the 5th. Goodbye, said Sara. When she reached the other side of the street, she looked back. The child had a bun in each hand and had stopped in the middle of a bite to watch her. Sara gave her a little nod, and the child, after another stare, a curious, lingering stare, jerked her shaggy head in response, and until Sara was out of sight, she did not take another bite or even finish the one she had begun. At that moment, the baker woman looked out of her shop window. Well, I never, she exclaimed, if that young one hasn't given her buns to a beggar child, and it wasn't because she didn't want them either. Well, she looked hungry enough. I'd give something to know what she did it for. She stood behind her window and for a few moments and pondered. Then her curiosity got the better of her. She went to the door and spoke to the beggar child. Who gave you those buns? She asked her. The child nodded in her head towards Sara's vanishing figure. What did she say? Inquired the woman. She asked me if I was hungry, replied the hoarse voice. What did you say? I said I was. And then she came in and got the buns and gave them to you, did she? The child nodded. How many? 5. The woman thought it over. Left just 1 for herself, she said in a low voice, and she could have eaten the whole 6. I saw it in her eyes. She looked after the little draggled, faraway figure and felt more disturbed in her usually comfortable mind than she had felt for many a day. I wish she hadn't gone so quickly, she said. I'm blessed if she shouldn't have had a dozen, and then she turned to the child. Are you hungry yet? She said. I'm always hungry, was the answer, but it wasn't as bad as it was. Come in here, said the woman, and she held the shop door open. The child got up and shuffled in. To be invited into a warm place full of bread seemed an incredible thing. She did not know what was going to happen. She did not even care. Get yourself warm, said the woman, pointing to a fire in the tiny back room. And look here, when you are hard up for a bit of bread, you can come in here and ask for it. I'm blessed if I won't give it to you for that young one's sake. Sara found some comfort in her remaining bun. At all events, it was very hot and it was better than nothing. And as she walked along, she broke off small pieces and ate them slowly to make them last longer. Suppose it was a magic bun, she said, and a bite was as much as a whole dinner. I should be overeating myself if I went on like this. It was dark when she reached the square where the select seminary was situated. The lights in the houses were all lighted. The blinds were not yet drawn in the windows of the room, where she nearly always caught glimpses of members of the large family. Frequently at this hour she could see the gentleman she called Mr. Montmorency sitting in a big chair with a small swarm around him, talking, laughing, perching on the arms of his seat or on his knees or leaning against them. This evening the swarm was about him, but he was not seated. On the contrary, there was a good deal of excitement going on. It was evident that a journey was to be taken, and it was Mr. Montmorency who was going to take it. A carriage stood before the door, and a big piece of luggage was strapped upon it. The children were dancing about, chattering, and hanging on to their father. The pretty rosy mother was standing near him, talking as if she was asking final questions. Sara paused a moment to see the little ones lifted up and kissed, and the bigger ones bent over and kissed also. I wonder if he will stay away long, she thought. The luggage is rather large. Oh dear, how they will miss him. I shall miss him myself, even though he doesn't know I'm alive. When the door opened, she moved away, remembering the sixpence. But she saw the traveler come out and stand against the background of the warmly lighted hall, the older children still hovering about him. "Will Moscow be covered with snow?" said the little girl Janet. "Will there be ice everywhere? Shall you see the Tsar?" "I will write and tell you about it," he answered, laughing. "And I will send you pictures. Run into the house. It's a hideous damp night. I would rather stay with you than go to Moscow. Good night. Good night, duckies. God bless you." And he ran down the steps and jumped into the carriage. "If you find the little girl, give her our love," shouted Guy Clarence, jumping up and down on the doormat. Then they went in and shut the door. "Did you see?" Janet said to Nora as they went back to the room. "The little girl who's not a beggar was passing. She looked all cold and wet, and I saw her turn her head over her shoulder and look at us. Mama says her clothes always look as if they had been given to her by someone who was quite rich, someone who only let her have them because they were too shabby to wear. The people at the school always send her out on errands on the most horrid days and nights there are." Sara crossed the square to Miss Minchin's area steps, feeling faint and shaky. "I wonder who the little girl is," she thought. "The little girl who he is going to look for." And she went down the area steps, lugging her basket and finding it very heavy indeed. As the father of the large family drove quickly on his way to the station to take the train which was to carry him to Moscow, where he was making his best efforts to search for the lost little daughter of Captain Crewe. All right, beautiful friends. I really want to keep reading to you because the next chapter is super magical. And I know the chapters that I read to you are kind of sad, right? But are you starting to see how the dots are connecting? That they are looking for Sara, who's in the attic next door to them. And how Sara is profoundly kind. And she uses her imagination to support her when life is hard. And I think those were some of the themes that really spoke to me when I was a child. So, here's to making it through the hard parts. Finding a coin upon the ground is our sign of magic. And I am grateful you are letting me share this story with you. So, I wish you sweet dreams. I am grateful for you. And I'm sending you love. Be well. Thank you.